Welcome, everybody. We are very delighted to have Danny Cook, Miora J. Cooker, and Diane Smothers talk about an introduction to person-centered management about their book. I'm going to pass it off to them now. Welcome, and thank you guys for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to kick us off. My name is Moya Kirker, and I'm so delighted to be here with Danny and Diane to talk about this great collection that we had the privilege of editing. I see some of our chapter authors in the audience, which is very exciting. But first, I want to thank everyone, if you signed up for the previous time, for dealing with the rescheduling. We are very grateful for the opportunity to reschedule and that you have joined us. So today we are talking about person-centered management, and we're using our book. Can I get the next slide, please? Thank you. Person-centered management in academic libraries. This was inspired by our work for the Conference of Academic Library Management, which is founded on the idea of person-centered management in academic libraries, which we're going to define today and walk through the three core tenets of person-centered management. And as we walk through what those three components are, we're going to highlight some of the chapters that really bring those concepts to the forefront. We have a limited time, and it is not it's not every chapter in the book. So if you're an author and don't see yourself represented here, we had hard decisions to make, but the concepts run through every chapter, and we're so grateful for each of our authors. So I'm going to kick it over to Danny to give us some baseline definitions.
Awesome. Thanks, Moya. Hi, everyone. I'm Danny Brecker-Cook, one of the co-editors. Just before we get into the content here, please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A box as we go. I think we have a chat as well, and you're totally welcome to use the chat, but if you put it in the Q&A, we'll definitely see your question. We will have some interactive time at the end as well. And we have so many links in our slide deck for you, including links to open access repository copies of some of the chapters we'll talk about today. We'll make sure you get that before the end of this webinar as well. So with that, I'm going to jump into our definition. So what is person-centered management? Why is this a concept that is a little bit different maybe than other ways that we've talked about management before as a field? So in our book, in the introduction, we define person-centered management as a management philosophy and practice, which explicitly acknowledges that we are unique individuals who bring all of our experiences, our preferences, and our needs into the workplace with us. So we are full humans, and just because we come to work doesn't mean that stops. So in order for us to successfully create environments where people can fully succeed at work and participate in functional teams, the needs of each individual must be surfaced and then authentically considered. So that's not to say, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in just a minute, that if somebody says that they want something, that they're always going to get it, but that there is a conversation to be had there. So this is related to other management philosophies that are out there. I think servant leadership is a neighboring management philosophy. But I think one major difference between person-centered management and something like servant leadership is also acknowledging that managers are not just there for the use of the direct reports, but that there's a relationship that occurs there. And the managers also matter in that they bring their experience, preferences, and needs into the workplace as well. So acknowledging all the people in the workplace as full people with needs and wants and preferences. So this comes out of the work of Carl Rogers, who was a mid-20th century, I guess I better say now, psychologist who came up with the concept of person-centered therapy, which talked a lot about the relationship between the client, the person who came to the therapist, and the therapist themselves. Over the course of his career, Rogers became more interested in education and took this same philosophy and applied it to the classroom. That's where I first became familiar with his work and did some work with my colleague Kevin Klipfel, who's now at USC, about what that looks like in the library classroom. So when we started CALM, we thought, well, what does that look like in the management setting? And tried to apply some of those same thoughts and ideas to the academic library management framework. There's other work out there about person-centered management that came out in the 90s, but it really has kind of become a more popular idea in the last 6 or 7 years. So in the Rogerian framework, there's 3 components to person-centeredness. So one, congruence, that means being authentically oneself and mirroring that authenticity with the client and the therapist. Unconditional positive regard, meaning that no matter what someone tells you, you still hold them with esteem. So Rogers talks a lot about this in the parental relationship. So no matter what someone does, your child does, or someone else does, like you still respect them as a person who's bringing all of their different experiences together. This can be challenging to achieve, but definitely aspirational. And then empathy. So feeling the things that other people feel, putting yourself in their shoes and trying to understand where they're coming from. So in the book, we put these into kind of 3 hortatory conditions for managers to be thinking about. So one, being authentic. So not that you need to share everything about yourself at all times in the workplace. That's not a fair expectation, but being clear, being real with the things that you're thinking about and feeling, and trying to have that authentic relationship with others that you work with. Being curious, so asking why, thinking about what are some of those underlying conditions or the underlying things that people may be bringing into the workplace with them. If a behavior is weird, it is coming from somewhere. So trying to understand what might be driving that and working together to come up with a solution to help everyone be successful. And then being open. So being open to other people's experiences, being open to other ideas. I think closely tied with curiosity, but not exactly the same. And we're going to expand a little bit on all of these with some of the chapters as examples. So what is person-centered management? So I alluded to this a little bit earlier. So it's an acknowledgement of and respect for our common humanity, that we're all people coming into the workplace. We live in a society where we all, for the most part, have to work. We bring our best selves and our worst selves to that workplace, as one might expect. It is a harm mitigation framework, so it's not something that will resolve all of the challenges of working in a capitalist society, but it's a way of thinking about how can we center the individual, how can we make more ethical choices, how can we make choices that that help people be successful, and it is centered in this idea of care. What it's not is, for example, creating roles that don't serve an organizational mission. So if someone's favorite thing to do is knit, for example, we're going to say knitting. None of my co-presenters here like to knit. I'm kidding. But we might not have a knitting librarian in our library, even though that's the thing that could be someone's preference. But it might not serve our academic organizational mission. So what is something that would bridge the gap between what someone really might prefer to spend their time and something that the organization needs, so that they can both be successful and both be fulfilled? It's not a lack of accountability. So trying to meet people where they are and have respect for their preferences and needs doesn't mean that folks can do whatever they want. Again, it is a negotiation. We're all trading our labor for our paycheck. And it is trying to, again, create that bridge between what the organization needs and what the individual needs. It's not avoiding difficult conversations. In fact, I think I would argue that person-centered management might mean having more difficult conversations so that you can get at some of those real underlying causes and things that might be driving certain behaviors or challenges that people may be experiencing. And it's not favoritism. It's something that should be applied across all the folks that we work with. And it might look different for different people, the way we interact with different people, the relationships we have with different people based on their needs and our needs. But it isn't something that we would only apply to a certain individual in an organization. Okay, so that is a little bit of an intro to the chapters, and now we're going to move into some examples of what this looks like in practice through our amazing authors in this book. So let me turn it over to Diane. Or Moya, are you next? Okay.
Yeah. Hi. So congruence is being authentic. So I'm going to start with a couple of definitions to ground us, and then look at some examples of what this looks like in the chapters. So we define congruence as the state of being genuine with oneself or authentic. And that's great. And I think maybe intuitive, but what does that mean when we're looking at interpersonal relationships, since that's the sort of the crux of person-centered management? And to that, we would say on the next slide, in an interpersonal relationship, congruence is achieved by creating space to have feelings about the other person, acknowledging those emotions internally, and considering their effect on interactions. So it is a deeply reflective process, right? It's not and then taking that reflection and applying it to the interactions that you're having. And I think the three examples that we're going to highlight, chapters we're going to highlight here, really show that, and show sometimes the tension that I would say, not sometimes, the tension that almost always arises with being authentic and interacting with others. So the first chapter I want to talk about, and while it comes up, I'm going to drop the URL into the chat to an institutional repository copy, is Instilling Harmony, Building Trust, an Integrated Approach to Managing in Libraries as Women of Color by Tarita Anatache, Betsaida Reyes, and Cecilia Tellis. My apologies for any mispronunciation. And they really talk about authenticity as an act of vulnerability and is paired with trust and transparency. And I imagine many people here, no matter whether you're a manager or someone who is managed, which we all are, the question of how authentic can I be with the person in front of me is probably something you've grappled with at one point or another with an individual. And to choose to be authentic is and can be an incredibly vulnerable experience that requires trust and transparency. And so the chapter authors really interrogate this, particularly as all managers of color. So they describe authenticity as an internal reflective practice and an invitation to others. I know I've experienced this as well, but like being authentic, you can't expect authenticity from others if you're not doing the act yourself, right? Because it's that act of vulnerability and trust building. But in order for this to happen, right, individuals still work within systems, and for managers or people to feel they can be authentic, we need supportive organizations to embrace that, particularly with our marginalized, with folks in the library from marginalized identities. And so what I really appreciate about this chapter is this sort of interrogation of how women managers of color find harmony, so like a balance with their intersecting professional and personal identities. And they really challenge our organizations to be better and allow for spaces to have that authenticity. So I encourage everyone to go check out that wonderful chapter. The next chapter I'd like to highlight is, and again, I will grab the institutional repository link, looks at not management directly per se, but mentorship through the person-centered lens. So it's Strengthening Person-Centered Management Through Mentorship, Building Library Community by Angela Yan, Grace Albach, and Susan R. Franzen. And so they are talking about making a connection between person-centered management and leadership with whole person mentorship. And they're using a mentor program that they were part of at Illinois State University. And this chapter really stands out to me when I revisited preparing for this as a reminder that one of the interesting things, and we'll get to this in sort of the interactive part today, is so many of these chapters are contextualized by COVID and how we all interacted as people, as workers, as managers during the pandemic. And this chapter really talks about building a mentorship program during these very difficult times when connection with colleagues was maybe not what we were used to. And so they talk about, again, trust and sharing. You'll notice the word trust with this concept of congruence comes up a lot, are critical to authentic mentoring experiences. And that whole person mentorship approach bridges the personal and professional. Again, you'll notice that in a mentoring partnership and allows for authentic relationship building. And so again, so some themes we're seeing here, you know, this connection between personal and professional, because to be authentic is deeply personal, and the idea that trust is required. So I encourage you all to look at it. It's a very practical chapter with some advice if you have a mentoring program or are interested in starting one within your library. The next chapter is linked here in the chat. And is one that I wrote for the book. So it's called Express Intellectual Humility, a framework for the person-centered library manager. And so in the chapter, I explore this concept of what started with intellectual humility, but ends up being expressed because intellectual humility itself is like an internal process, and it's how we show it to the people around us that is the thing that could like theoretically be measured, although I don't touch measuring it in this chapter. And there are multiple components to it, but two sort of central ones are a willingness to see oneself accurately and a recognition of one's fallibility. And while you might not think authenticity is directly related to that, um, the research shows that most intellectually humble people uh, are deeply authentic, right? And so congruence is in this construct calls for authenticity, honesty, transparency, and clarity. And those are all concepts that are either directly related to congruence or sort of in the person-centered management general ethos. And one thing I push back on a lot that I saw in the literature that I think just stood out to me is like the same question that the first chapter I mentioned brings up is like, what are the limits to authenticity and who is actually able to be authentic in the workplace? There's a lot of research and studies that women, younger managers, people of color, people from LGBTQ or in queer identities do not face the same bar to be able to show intellectual humility. And so if that's the case, how useful could it actually be as a concept? But authenticity is sort of central to this concept. So again, just a potpourri, a spattering of chapters that sort of highlight this. But this idea of congruence runs throughout many of the chapters. But we're going to hear about some more next from the next person who's talking about unconditional positive regard.
Hi, so I'm Diane Smothers, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about unconditional positive regard. And the definition that we have in the introduction to the book says that in unconditional positive regard is the idea that a person should be valued simply because they are a fellow human and that no action makes them intrinsically more or less worthy of regard. And Danny mentioned earlier that this can sometimes present as like, you know, you as a manager may encounter an unexpected behavior. And you may want to ask why. Why is this happening, or what is the reason behind it? And you can go a little bit more proactive with that and start even before or without any kind of unusual behavior coming forth, or even if it's just something like a perfectly reasonable request. I would like to have this to happen. Well, is there a reason for that? Because it might be that it's something that you can do, but if you explore it a little bit more, you might discover that there's something underlying that request that you can work together to resolve or to change. So I've got a few chapters to get us started. And the first one, I'm going to put I'll try to put the link to it in. I I'm failing at copying the link. Moya or Danny, if one of you could put that in there for me. Thank you. So it's You Think You Know, Where Learning-Centered Pedagogy Meets Management by Elizabeth Galuzis. And this is actually the first chapter in the book. And it ends with, I thought I knew, but I didn't. And I found that very compelling. When we start often as managers, you think you know what you're getting into, you think you know how you're going to approach it, and then it turns out you didn't. And I really appreciated that this chapter explores that. She talks about her journey into management, how she learned, how she got into learner-centered pedagogy and in the classroom, and coming to discover that what she thought she knew about management wasn't quite what she thought it was. She found that it was very easy to center herself in the learning, and then when it came to management, having to go out and center others. For example, preferring a hands-off management style, and that's the example that she gives, and then coming to discover that her direct reports preferred a little bit more structure. So finding that what works for you may not work for somebody else, and learning to adapt to that, and coming into creating questions for her team to help build space for authenticity. So you'll find in a lot of these chapters there's a little bit of overlap. So it's not just about being curious, is about trying to build authenticity. So she's creating these questions, she's being curious and learning, and then in the end, just say, hey, there's more for me to learn, there's more for me to do, and I thought I knew it. I thought I knew these things, but I didn't. And I felt like that's a great call for being curious and being willing to explore what you can do. And then in the next chapter, which is Ask 5 Questions by Megan Kowalski, that dives a little bit deeper in that. And I don't have a link for this chapter. So I didn't want to crowd up the screen, the slide, with a lot of questions, but she has 5 questions here that I thought were really very interesting. And they're, what's going on? What do you like about your work? What do you not like about your work? What do you want to be working on? And what can I do better? And I think for those of us who may need a little bit of help, a little bit of guidance, these are great questions to begin with. And I appreciate that she put those into this chapter, not just the questions themselves, but diving into the why, because maybe that's not your style. Maybe that's not the questions that you want to ask. So you can go into the purpose behind these questions and develop your own questions to ask your team. And a little bit of advice on how to get started. If you've never done this kind of thing, if you've never asked these questions, how do you do it? How do you begin to ask your team questions that they can answer to help you in your management? And how do you use what you learn? And this is where some of that proactivity comes into place, where maybe there's something that is going on. Everybody finds that the things they don't want to do or that they don't enjoy doing, maybe there's a solution to that. And as a team, you can work together and come up with a creative solution that will work for everyone. And I think I think she gave the example of shelf reading. So you don't want to shelf read for 4 hours at a time. So breaking up those hours, so you're not shelf reading in large chunks, but in smaller chunks. And then finally, she encourages growth and change. And I thought that was really helpful as well. So asking the 5 questions and using what you learn, and then continuing to be flexible and continuing to grow. So I thought this was a great practical chapter, and I encourage you to go in and take a look at this chapter to get started with the practice of being curious, because you need to ask questions if you're going to be curious, because you don't necessarily know. And then the next chapter, which is at the intersection of person-centered management and learner-centered pedagogy, training, managing, and mentoring student staff by Matthew Wyrick Johnson and Renee Romero. So this was interesting because they have 2 case studies that they're looking at, and it's specifically about student staff, student workers, although you can apply this more broadly to management in general. And the 2 case studies are, and hopefully I get this this right, the WIRE and UESOS. And one of them, WIRE, is more project focused, and UESOS is more service staff oriented, so service points. And they approach this in different ways. So I like that they go in and they explore what they've done, and they talk about how they're building these teams with their students. So they give a good overview of these 2 teams, and WIRE, I believe, is learner designers, and UE is user engagement. So they're very different groups. And I think a lot of times, at least for me, I tend to hear more about user engagement and service desk and less about the project-oriented departments. So I thought it was really great to hear about these 2 different types of student workers and how they approach their mentoring. And it came down to things like co-creation of values. One department did that, one didn't, but there's still a shared set of guiding principles for both. So they have a similar approach, and they're responsive across the board to their student worker feedback. And they gave some examples of how they listened. So they're asking the questions, they're talking to their students, they're working together with their students in responding to their students in things like flexibility and scheduling. And so one department can do this more easily than the other because there are different types of teams, but it can be done, and flexibility and communication. And here the takeaway is listening and talking to your student staff, responding to their feedback and working together with them, and being curious about who they are and what their lives are, and not assuming that things about them, really digging into what their needs are. And you might learn something surprising and helpful. The next chapter is, I also don't have the link for this one. It's Boundaries as Meeting Places, Rethinking Boundary Setting Within the Managerial Relationship by Veronica Arellano Douglas. And I really appreciated this chapter because it was another deep dive into reflection. You're not just curious about your team, you should be curious about yourself, and thinking about the boundaries that you have and what happens when you don't have them or you need to reset them. And I thought this is a really great chapter about those. And she explores workplace boundaries through the lens of relational cultural theory and takes you very carefully through that lens. And then she goes on to show that it's really not a dividing line. We're not just thinking about boundaries like this sharp line. It's a differentiation, and there are role boundaries, because there are power differentials. For example, supervisors supervise through your peers, and what does that look like? And throughout the chapter, there are reflection questions that you can use, whether you're a supervisor or whether you're being supervised, and maybe you're both. So I really, really appreciated this chapter a lot. And I spent a fair amount of time with this. I can't wait to go back and reread it and go through these questions, because I think it's really helpful to be curious about yourself and to be curious about your own boundaries and your relationship with others. So I really like this chapter a lot. So I hope you get a chance to go in and read through that yourself. And now I'm going to pass it off to Danny.
All right, thanks, Diane. So I'm going to take us through the last frame of empathy, or this idea of being open to other people's experiences. So Carl Rogers defined empathy as to be with another in this way, means that for the time being, you lay aside the values that you hold for yourself in order to enter another's world without prejudice. This is a really lovely definition of empathy. I would argue that it's definitely aspirational. It's pretty hard to put aside everything about yourself to completely be in someone else's shoes. But the idea of trying to understand someone else is, I think, so key for building relationships that are meaningful and put you in a position for trust and being able to move forward together towards shared solutions. So I'm going to talk about 3 chapters really briefly. So the first chapter I want to highlight is by Kat Kim Bell, and it is called Listening Practices for the Manager. So in this chapter, Kat talks about a reflective process that she underwent while she was starting a master's degree in organizational development. And she gives some concrete exercises for folks to take on to improve our listening skills. So the first step to being an empathetic person is really to listening to what other folks are saying. And that is a practice. It's something that we always have to try to continue getting better at. And Kat has some really great ideas for ways that we can hone this skill. So one exercise that I have up here on the screen is about observing a conversation. So either one that you yourself are participating in or one that you're just watching. And that could be even like a YouTube video conversation, but thinking about what is being said, what is being unsaid, what's under the surface, what are some things that maybe you would do differently, what are different questions that you might ask to get deeper into the underlying reasons for things that people are saying. And I found this very helpful to think about, and I hope that you all will too. And definitely encourage you to check out some of those other exercises that she suggests. The next chapter I'm going to talk about is called Inclusive Interviewing, which frames interviewing as a practice for building a healthy relationship with your future colleagues, which I love that framing for what interviewing is. This is by Rebecca C. Hyde, Amanda B. Albert, Jamie L. Emery, and Sarah E. Fancher. And in this chapter, they once again call back to the 2020 pandemic as a time for thinking differently about the ways in which we're doing our work. So in this case, they're thinking about virtual interviewing, which became a necessity during the pandemic, as actually something that is really helpful for us to use as an inclusive tool moving forward, even if we're not in an acute pandemic situation. There's a lot of really great ideas for specifics of the virtual interview process, as well as where you might include some physical interviewing. But the thing, again, that drives all of these ideas is thinking about the folks that you're interviewing as future colleagues, thinking about the experiences, the responsibilities that they may have in their life outside of work, and not making them disclose things that may be uncomfortable or unnecessary for them in order to do their job. So one of the through lines of all the things that they share is communicating clearly and thoroughly throughout the process. I'm sure we all have some exciting stories of interviews that we've engaged with in the past as candidates or otherwise. And I think that's something that you want to start in the interview process for helping people understand what the expectations are, and then of course carry through once they're actually your colleague. A lot of the things that they recommend are universal design principles, meaning that if someone needed an accommodation, these things would already have that in mind, but they're actually great for everybody, right? So if someone, for example, is immunocompromised and they can't travel for the interview, that would be a thing that might result in a virtual interview, but there's a lot of benefits for everyone in participating in a virtual interview. And then finally, one of the things that they bring up as an example of having empathy for other folks is thinking about the costs of the interview. And so that may be the direct costs. So for example, there are some institutions where you have to actually pay the upfront travel costs and then be reimbursed later at some point in the future after you may have accrued interest on your credit card, just for example. And thinking about what the impact of that might be, but also the other costs, which could be needing to find caregiving, needing to have other additional things, either direct financial costs or indirect financial costs for every person to kind of uproot their lives for this potentiality. And just keeping that in mind as a thing as we plan our interview processes and thinking about what kinds of circumstances we want to create for our future colleagues to think highly of us and want to come work with us. So I thought this chapter was really compelling. I definitely encourage y'all to check it out. And then the last chapter I'm going to talk about is called Compassion in Academic Library Leadership and Management. And this is by our colleagues at Colorado, Julianne Couture, Rebecca Kuglich, and Jenny Gerke. So compassion, I learned, is actually defined as empathy in action. So what are those actual actions that you're taking based on the empathetic approach that you're engaging with? So what are the things that you're going to do differently to show that you are considering what other folks are going through? That can look like sending flowers, for example, when someone experiences a personal loss. Or it could look like building policies and structures to ensure that everyone is treated equally or equitably within the workplace. So one of so this chapter begins very theoretical and then moves into the practical. But one of the questions that they raise that I want to share with y'all is that despite we focus on kind of the acute pressures of what's happening day to day, are there ways for us to think structurally and consistently about who our employees are as individuals and how we can do a better job in supporting them in self-actualizing in the workplace? Or are there things that we're doing right now that are really preventing people from doing their best work? And can we build structures that allow people to do their best work? So I thought that that was a really helpful question to be thinking about because it can be really challenging for us to take that step back. But we're going to be playing whack-a-mole forever in terms of trying to get to a healthier workplace unless we start thinking about these structural things, which I really appreciated about their insight. One other insight that they share is being willing to clearly state unpleasant information. I remember hearing the clear is kind quote from Brene Brown by way of Katrina Davis Kendrick at Calm in 2021, and that blew my mind. And this was just a different way of thinking about that. Giving people the grace to understand the reality of the situation and then respond to that in a real way. And providing structures to help them through that, whether that might be time or support from employee support services or helping mentor, et cetera, having mentorship structures in place. These are all examples of compassion in action and building structures to support folks. So we're going to talk now about a couple of current examples. We're in the midst of a lot of things this year. 2025 has been a bazillion years long. I'm going to turn it over to Diane to get us started, and then we'll move into this discussion phase.
Okay, so our question then is, as we were talking about this, this presentation, is how in these difficult times can we be person-centered? And one of the things that I noticed going through this book, and Moya mentioned this earlier, is that a lot of these chapters talk about the difficult time of being in the middle of lockdown in pandemic mode, and how they adjusted to that and became person-centered or worked on person-centered practices to get through those times. And I'm thinking, you know, again, as I go through some of these other chapters and hearing about these, the way that these authors work to become person-centered, there's always difficult times, there's always challenging times, and there might be a lot of challenges around you. And I realize that you can do this, I think, personally, and feel free to start off this discussion and jump in. There are things that I can do personally within my own little bitty department to be person-centered. And if I'm working within, like I can't go and maybe give everybody an extra 3 weeks off, but there are other things that I can do. Maybe I can listen, I can work on my boundaries, or I can do something else. And there's just so many examples in this book. So I think that is our question to you. And is it time? Let's go on to the next slide to help us get started as well.
Yeah, so I think, and this is from our introduction, right, Danny? I believe. Yeah. So we circled around this question so many times. What can we say? What do we feel comfortable saying in a recorded session? What are we safe to say, depending on what states we are in, and what countries we're in right now, right? But we came down to this quote that really resonated with us, that person-centered management centers the unique characteristics of each individual and guides managers to explore the tension between workplace demands and individual needs. And Danny mentioned this. It's something that I think about a lot. Like the vast majority of us are here because we need to make a living. And we found a career probably that we like and enjoy, but we're still here making money by somebody who pays us. And so sometimes we are restricted by the system. We're almost always restricted in ways by the system, the institutions that we work within. And person-centered management is exploring that tension of, I have these workplace restrictions, demands, but I also want to like deeply recognize the humanity in the people around me and myself, and sort of working through that tension in all of these various ways. And so we want to ask you the same question to consider. And so we've set up an anonymous Padlet that we can drop the link into the chat in a second too. We've got a QR, we've got all of the options, right? QR code, a bit.ly, and then also in the chat here. It should be anonymous. You can click the plus button. I believe it will be in the bottom right corner of your screen to add any thoughts. And as you're doing that, we can open it up to discussion, to questions. Yeah.
So I'll stop sharing my screen for just a second so I can get us over to the Padlet. But yeah, thank you everyone for joining us, and we're looking forward to the discussion now with you.
And we can turn off the recording if this to open up the discussion. So why don't we do that?
I love that idea. Thank you.
Great, thanks.